Thank you. Thank you, Dollar General. Now we can continue with the second part of the panel on literacy and learning. And as you see, we have quite a contrast from the number of people that have been up here in the previous sessions, but they're all involved in the papers that we have now. And the first paper is on digital inclusion and digital literacy in the United States, and it's Steve Reeder from Portland State University.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really very pleased to be here. We heard this morning that there's this new thing called problem solving in technology-rich environments, and it's sort of new in adult surveys, and it is, and that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. Because it's new, I wondered how to approach it in this paper. And I wanted to tell you my starting point, where I'm coming from, because that may help me explain where I got to in trying to understand this new assessment and some of the related information in PIAAC. I was involved with a large group of people in a BTOP project called Digital Literacy Acquisition in Vulnerable Populations. And this wound up serving, almost 14,000 people in 125 computer labs in about 6 states across the country. And there are several people in the room here who were really deeply involved in that work, and I'd just like to mention them. Gwen Weaver from the Department of Commerce. Hi, Gwen. Jen Vanek from Minnesota, and David Rosen from Massachusetts. And there were also not only support from the Department of Commerce for that work, but my colleague Jill Kastick and her team at Portland State University have a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, I think, who was going to be here today, Sandy Toro, but unfortunately couldn't make it. But they're funding a very close look at digital literacy acquisition in these vulnerable populations. And that is really my starting point, even before PIAAC here. And it's very significant because one of the things that I saw looking at all of that work going on across the country was how what I want to call deeply embedded digital literacy is in a range of equity and opportunity issues that exist in these communities. And that was really my starting point for looking at digital literacy and digital inclusion in the PIAAC survey. So there are 2 topics there I want to mention that I'm going to come back to. One is digital equity, and the other is digital embedding. And I'll come back and try and define those in a little bit. So very quickly, I think you all know that the emergence and use of new information and communication technologies is dramatically changing all aspects of life, not only in the United States, but in most of the countries in the PIAAC survey. The U.S. lags behind its competitors in ICT adoption when we look at the comparative data. And let me just quickly, if I can get there quickly. Now I'm stealing data from OECD. These are not results of mine. Okay, so here's the U.S. We're just right on the OECD average in percent of households with computers, but we're falling behind if you look at the depth of the arrows. In the next slide, you can see this a little more dramatically. This is percentage of households in countries that have internet access at home in 2005 and 2013, and the U.S. is down here. Okay, so we're not doing all that well. And when I've looked at these data a little more, I see big equity issues in these data, and that, again, as I said, is a starting point for me. So I went into the data, I went into this project with two research questions. I wanted to look at the construct of digital equity. This is a big thing in my hometown of Portland. We have a group of city agencies and citizen groups trying to put digital equity into our city plan. And the question is, what is that, and what do we know about that, and how can they do it? And should we look at it in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of national origin, some of the major categories we generally frame equity issues in? So that's the first research question I have. The second research question is, what's the extent of digital embedding? That is, embedding of digital literacy in economic and social outcomes for adults. And these are some of the ones I wanted to look at. And I'll come back and define these terms operationally in my analyses in a little bit. So, like most people, I did a lot of multivariate modeling, and I'm going to try to summarize the results. My paper is full of tables and technical details. One thing that's really important is I'm not intending to represent causal relationships in showing you these statistical results. I think when we say literacy is deeply embedded in poverty, we don't necessarily mean, or I don't necessarily mean, literacy causes poverty. The causal relationships are multiple and in both directions, as we know. I'm not suggesting causal relationships today. So one thing that maybe some people don't realize is, unlike the literacy and numeracy assessments in PIAAC, the problem-solving in technology-rich environments was not administered to everyone. And in fact, there was a process of what I would call digital inclusion, kind of a mini digital inclusion process in the assessment situation that I wanted to look closely at, because only about 84% of the individuals in the United States population really took PSTRE. The others took paper-based assessments for various reasons that we'll look at. And if they took the paper-based assessment, they didn't get problem-solving in technology-rich environments. That, unlike literacy and numeracy assessment, was only available in computer-based assessment form. And this is the little logic model that, this is from OECD. If people had never used a computer, they were just routed away from the computer-based assessment. That was the first thing. If they had some computer experience, they took a core computer use screening test. I'm sorry, I skipped a step. If they had used a computer, they were asked if they would be willing to take a computer-based assessment. If they said no, they went to the paper-based assessment, and you didn't get a PSTRE. If they said sure, they took a screener to see if they had basic mouse and keyboarding skills, for example. If they passed that, they went on to take the PSTRE and the other assessments on the computer. If they didn't pass the screener, they were routed to the paper-based assessment. So there are those three stages. That's hard to keep in mind, but I think it's a basic paradigm of digital inclusion that's actually taking place there. So I wanted to look at that more closely, and I decided to think about this as a digital inclusion pathway. The first step is having access, and this is in this model paradigm. If you've never used a computer, you don't have access. Okay, so that's the access stage of this pathway. The second stage is what sociologists would call having a taste for using technology. Even if you've used a computer before, you might not have a taste. If you were asked, will you take the assessment on the computer, you could say no. And I'm operationalizing that as having the taste or not. So that's the taste stage. After that, there's a readiness stage. You have the basic keyboarding and mousing skills and so forth to use the computer. You can pass the screener. That's how it's operationalized. After that, you get to digital literacy, which involves using the computer for productive tasks, okay? So, and in PIAAC, there are really three things that measure that once you're in that stage, once you're using the computer in the PIAAC assessment. There's measures of use of ICT outside of work. These are a lot like the IRT scaled items that were mentioned this morning for numeracy practices. I'm going to call these ICT practices. Outside of work, ICT practices at work if you were employed. And then, of course, there was the cognitive proficiency, the PSTRE. And these are measures, not my definition of digital literacy, just measures of digital literacy within that stage. Okay. So instead of that diagram, we have the road to digital literacy. So I'm trying to think of this little yellow brick road. Here's the access stage. The barrier is you don't have access to computers. You're stuck here. If you do, you get to the taste stage where you develop interest, desire, confidence to use computers. You have a taste barrier. If you don't have that confidence, need, or desire, you're stuck here. The readiness stage, you develop basic skills. There's a readiness barrier. If you get through that, you're into digital literacy. Doesn't mean you're fully digitally literate. You're just in that stage. And when you're in that stage, you're being measured by PIAAC with ICT usage at home, at work, and with PSTRE. Okay, took me a long time to get that far. But it takes people a lot longer to get there in reality. So I want to look at digital equity along these stages of the digital inclusion pathway. And I'm going to operationally define it as not there. If we control for education and other demographic variables, there will not be differences that are based on your identity characteristics like gender, race, ethnicity, national origin. Okay, that's a conditional statement. And that's my working definition of digital equity. We can come back and argue about it later if you disagree. But it may vary across stages of my pathway, and that's I think, very important. And I used multivariate logistic regression and ordinal logit regression models to evaluate this. I'll show you the results. So there are lots of statistical tables behind this summary. I just want to call out a few things to your attention here. So this is showing you that women, everything else controlled, women have more digital access than men. That's a surprise, isn't it? We don't usually hear gender equity framed or inequity framed that way. Blacks and Hispanics have negative digital access. Digital inequity, not in their favor. Other minority groups were not different. These are the categories on the background questionnaire. Foreign-born, like the blacks and Hispanics, are at a disadvantage in terms of digital access. Notice education, as someone said this morning, almost always turns up in everything positive. So that's in here being controlled when I'm testing for equity. Okay, you can see some of the other results here. Things don't really vary across these stages. If we look at the pathway as a whole with an ordinal regression, we see pretty much the same pattern again. But when we get to the digital literacy stage and are looking at either ICT usage or PSTRE, we see some very different changes. Look what happens with women. They're positive all the way to here, and then they switch to significantly negative on the assessment of PSTRE. That's kind of interesting to me. There's digital equity in the use of the technology in this stage. There's no difference between men and women. For blacks, it's negative all the way through PSTRE, but no significant difference in usage of ICT as measured by PIAAC. Hispanics, the same. Other minority groups go from no significant difference in the earlier stages to a negative in digital literacy, the PSTRE, and then they actually are at an advantage in ICT use. Foreign-born immigrants are negative all the way across. So that's in a bird's eye. That's what we found looking at digital equity defined this way. Whoop. Now let me talk about digital embedding. It's defined, as you can see here, as a statistically significant association, not a causal one necessarily. I'm not looking for that, between the outcome and a digital literacy measure. In this case, it'll be an ICT usage or PSTRE proficiency after other associations in a multivariate context are controlled. That's going to be my definition of digital embedding. Whereas digital equity focuses on the inclusion of social groups, digital embedding focuses on the consequences of being digitally included in terms of economic and social outcomes. So there's a different focus in this research question. Here's another summary of many, many analyses. We'll take the economic outcomes first. So these are going to be very similar to analyses we saw in papers this morning. These are Mincer-like wage equations. I'm using log of monthly earnings for prime-age workers. And what I'm showing you here is that there's not only with education controlled and many other things that aren't even listed here controlled, including occupation and years of work experience, not only is proficiency in PSTRE positively associated with earnings, so is ICT use at work, very, very strongly associated with it. This is a big chunk of the variation that was not observed in the analyses this morning. And this is very robust, and I think it's very important that we understand it. So this is on this morning, we heard how 2 minutes, oh my goodness, I better get going. I'm just getting started. So ICT use outside of work is not associated with log of earnings among the same population. All right? Employment status is something entirely different. Very few things predict employment status well in this multivariate modeling context. Let me show you the social outcomes. These are ones that have been used in OECD's international and the U.S. national reports. Measures of social trust, volunteerism, political efficacy, and health status. These are all from the background questionnaire. The big message here is PSTRE is a predictor of social trust, but not the other social outcomes. ICT use outside of work is a positive predictor of all of these outcomes in a multivariate modeling context with education and many other things controlled. So where do I go with this? The equity issues look very different along the digital inclusion pathway, as we saw. There's clear importance for ICT use over and above PSTRE proficiency on all of the measures we looked at. There are differences between employment and earnings that are very suggestive of a need for very different programmatic strategies and models for dealing with the development of incumbent workers and unemployed workers. I didn't get much time to go into that, so I won't say more about that. And there are very strong relationships between ICT use outside of work and all of the social measures that we looked at. For future research, I would like to see cross-national comparisons. We had some wonderful examples of that this morning, extending these and comparing these results from the United States with other countries. I would also, and I'm actually in the middle of trying to do this, modeling the embedding of literacy and numeracy in these same economic and social outcomes. I think using education and skills online, particularly the PSTRE component, in some richer studies, as my colleague Jill Kastick and her colleagues at Portland State will be doing, will add a lot to our understanding of these relationships. And I think I will stop there.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know we're reaching that deadly post-lunch slump hour. We'll try to keep everyone awake as we talk about learning and not learning in the United States. And I will see how good my skills in technology are if I can get this to work. Hey, I feel really good.
Problem solved.
Problem solved, okay. And by the way, I've given it an acronym because in education we love acronyms, right? So PSTRE, I call it poster. If you don't like that, you can come up with another one, but I like poster. Okay. So by way of overview, I'd like to give you a little bit of context for the PIAAC findings that Usha and I came up with from the survey. And we'll talk a little bit about the key findings and implications of the findings for policy and practice and recommendations for future research. Okay. By way of context, this particular slide is not about PIAAC, but I think it gives us a little bit of the sense of the so what. Why are we talking about adult transitions to learning in the United States? What this graphic represents, and it looks green on my screen, but probably not on yours, but this is the shortfall that many states, in fact there are 30-some states up there, experience as a result of not having enough high school students coming out of high school and going into college. So because that's not happening, because we have population changes in our country, what we're seeing is that ultimately by 2020 there would be a shortfall in each of these states. If you look on the far left, you're looking at Texas, California, and Florida. To start with, hundreds of thousands of folks that we just don't have enough there to fill the jobs that are needed, the high skill level jobs, because people have not gotten the advanced education. I think that's very, very important to acknowledge that the only way we're going to get there is if we have folks who are adults that are participating in education somehow. So I wanted to start with that as context. Moving on from there, I think a lot of us were aware when we saw the report last year, Time for the U.S. to Reskill, question mark, that the skill levels for the United States in literacy, numeracy, and poster are substantially lower than they are compared with the international average. And in fact, the U.S. average is about level 2. And as I think Johan referred to very early this morning, he talked about the large number of U.S. adults that have very low skills below level 2. And he didn't note this, but he has in other sessions that there were 3 million people with low skills who would have liked to participate in adult education and training but didn't. I think those numbers are very important. A little bit of further context getting into the study now. We defined learners as adults who participated in either formal or non-formal learning in the 12 months before PIAAC assessment. If they did not participate in either formal or non-formal learning, we called them non-learners. Now that doesn't mean that they're not learning informally perhaps, but that was not tracked as such in the data set. So please bear with our terminology as we talk about learners and non-learners. That's how we've defined them. And we further classified adults into 3 categories based on their highest educational attainment level. Less than high school, and if you read in the paper it'll tell you which exact ISED levels that's referring to, high school level and post-secondary education level. One other finding, one new finding I should say, that I would like to point out is that an estimated 80 million less than high school and high school level adults are in the pool for formal education. I think that's a tremendous opportunity that we have in this country that we all need to be aware of. A large portion of those are what we classified as non-learners, and an additional proportion of those pursue non-formal learning, but they never, or have not at least recently, got to formal learning. Okay, so what do the adult learners and non-learners look like in terms of the breakout? If you look at the darker, oh, yours is purple, okay. All right, if you look at the darker purple beginning at the top and working your way around to the right, you can see the less than high school learners, followed by the high school learners, and then that largest block kind of at the bottom represents the post-secondary education learners. So those are the folks that are learning that already have a post-secondary degree. And then the non-learner proportions follow after that in the lighter purple color accordingly. Okay, this is probably way too small for the folks in the back of the room to read, so I encourage you to take a look at the PowerPoint, or even better yet the paper, when those are made available, and I understand that they will be posted sometime in the near future. A few demographic pieces of information about learners and non-learners that we would like to pass along. One of the things that we noticed when we looked regionally in the United States is that there tended to be higher proportions of learners in the Northeast and the Midwest, and higher proportions of non-learners in the South and the West portions of the country. And again, I realize you can't read the numbers, but I'll just give you a little bit of the information here as we go. Another very interesting demographic feature is, of course, age, and we were talking about that just before we had lunch. So what we're seeing is that the learners at their various levels tend to have a much lower median age than the non-learners. So the median age for the non-learners was 45 to 49 years old. That was a bit of a surprise to me. I don't know if it is to you all, but it definitely surprised us when we first looked at that. We also tend to see high proportions of low-income folks at the less than high school and the high school level. No surprise there, most likely, because that's been found in previous studies related to these international data sets. At the bottom, the last 3 rows talk about people with difficulties seeing or difficulties hearing or with learning disabilities. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at us in this study when we looked at that was that the proportion of those things was much higher in non-learners than in learners. So I think that's telling as well. Okay. We also took a look in this paper at skill levels. So we looked at literacy, numeracy, and poster. So the blue line that you see here represents literacy, and we've divided it into 2 graphics, learners and non-learners, and I tried to lay these side by side so that you could, even if you can't see the numbers from here, you can at least see the lines. And you can see that even at the less than high school level, it starts a little bit higher for the learners than it does for the non-learners. And then the range goes up as you go through the high school learners and the post-secondary learners. But when you look at the non-learners, regardless of their educational attainment, it doesn't get quite as high. All of those differences are significant between groups and between categories as well. In terms of poster skills, this one's laid out a little bit differently. Now we have the less than high school, the high school, and the PSE along the bottom of the graph. And what we're looking at the top is the green line represents the learners, and the blue line represents the non-learners. The other thing I'd like to point out about this is you see that the range is fairly restricted between level 1 and just barely getting to level 2 there. And I think that goes back to the point C was just making a few moments ago about whether folks were included or not in relationship to digital literacy and poster. Okay, so we also talked in the paper about the types of adult learning. So this is the folks that we classified as learners. About 2/3 of them participated in non-formal education of some kind. There was approximately 11% that participated only in formal learning, and then the remainder participated in both. Moving on from there, another table that's difficult to see, but a few points that I'll highlight is that most of the folks that we looked at were in fact employed. A few differences, non-learners tended to be more on permanent disability status than learners were. They also tended to be something that they called NEET, which stands for not employed, not in education or training. That also was a much higher proportion for non-learners than it was for learners. I think the last thing that I wanted to point out from that set of data in the table is that the vast majority of both learners and non-learners were quite satisfied with their jobs. It exceeded 75% in just about every category. However, there was quite a bit more tendency for the non-learners to stay at their same job. They had less mobility than the learners did. So I think that was an important finding to point out as well. Okay. So how did they learn? What were the methods of learning for non-formal opportunities? We didn't look at more of the specifics for formal, but we did look at some specifics for non-formal learning. The most prevalent one was on-the-job training. Okay, so what you're looking at here, the blue bars, or purple, depending on what you're looking at, represent the less than high school group. The green bars represent the high school group. On-the-job training, or OJT, was the most prevalent type of learning that they pursued. That was followed by seminars and workshops. There was a question related to that on the background questionnaire. And then comes distance learning, or DL. And then the last category was private lessons. And you can see that the percentages drop off pretty sharply in terms of who's participating in those different types of learning. And I think it's very telling that with the distance learning percentages particularly being so low, it makes me wonder what relationship does that have to those relatively low poster skills that we were seeing. That's not something that we pursued in this paper, but it's definitely a question that came up as we interpreted the results. And the last major finding that I would like to share today has to do with employer support for either formal or non-formal learning. So if you look at the blue bars on this chart, and again, I realize you probably can't see all of the numbers, but if you just look at the colors, the blue bars represent full or partial employer support. So what we're seeing here is that employers tend to support those who already have the post-secondary degrees to get additional training or education. And it's particularly noticeable in the top set of bars, which represents the formal, but it's also noticeable in the non-formal. Those folks that have less than a high school education already get the least employer support. So we've got a little bit of what they call a Matthew effect going on here, where the rich get richer and the poor stay very poor. And I don't mean to say that in any disrespectful way whatsoever. It just is very noticeable in these data in terms of the support that employers are providing for their employees. Okay. So let's move on to implications. We noted in our paper a number of implications for policymakers, for adult and continuing education, and for employers. First of all, for policymakers, it looks like there's a lot of opportunity out there to review policies on formal and non-formal learning that could impact particularly non-traditional adult learners who are so needed. Going back to that very first slide that I showed you, we definitely have the need there. So if we're looking at adults with low income, men who perhaps have become disengaged in learning, adults with learning disabilities or physical disabilities for that matter. One of the needs that again, I'm in the same boat as everybody else. It was a large paper and very short number of slides. So I'm kind of leaping here, but one of the things that we talked about in the paper is definitely the cost issue. As you just saw in the previous slide on employer support, if they're not being supported by their employer to go to further educational opportunities, then they have to come up with the funds themselves. And if you're talking about a population that's primarily low income, probably the money isn't there. And so there's an opportunity, I think, for policymakers to consider how can we get funding for part-time adult learners to continue learning? How can that happen? Particularly if there are issues associated with disabilities. I think it's ultimately important for incentives to be available to employers to help in that process, and for policies to be developed that support small businesses to provide workplace training or even educational benefits for external education. We also have several recommendations for adult and continuing education. I realize I'm getting kind of low on my time, so I will be a little bit selective in talking about some of these, but I do encourage you to read them in the full paper when you have a chance. So we're suggesting that adult and continuing education could collaborate with employers to the extent possible to help folks have access to instruction during work hours, to get tuition costs covered. We're also suggesting there's a connection there of employee mobility and learning, and so how could that be taken advantage of in terms of employers being able to provide training for new employees, or perhaps for transitioning employees as well. And then let's go ahead and move on to the last set of implications, and those are for workplaces. So one of the concerns related to the workplace is simply that learning needs to be accessible for adults at all levels, so employees at all levels, not just those that have the college degrees already, but those that do not have the high school degree, or those that did graduate from high school and may have stopped their learning experiences, even temporarily. So a couple of ways that could happen would be for employers to find ways to provide release time so that employees could get involved in learning. Perhaps to establish employer-employee task forces that could tackle some of the barriers that come up that employees face. And also to encourage some of these more experienced and well-trained post-secondary level folks to mentor and coach some of the less established or folks with less education to gain learning and greater engagement in the workplace. Okay. A few recommendations for future research, and then I'll conclude. We think that it's important to continue looking at these relationships of learning and skills. They're in lots of different ways. I don't have time to go into all the details at this point, but particularly I think that connection with distance learning would be worth looking at. I personally think it's important to know even more about the non-learners, what's going on with them, and to understand what might be happening to them and how we can retain them once we actually get them to come back to learning. And then finally we have recommendations related to formal and non-formal learning, and we encourage you to look at those in the full paper. I realize my time is up, and so I thank everyone for listening, and I'll look forward to your questions.
So I'm just going to very briefly lay out what our task was. The purpose of this study was to analyze the PIAAC data with the aim of, of examining the importance of readiness to learn to adult literacy skills, as well as their uses of these and other important skills in different contexts. Adult readiness to learn is not our term. It's a term that was used within the PIAAC, and we will define it more, or we'll attempt to define it more as we go along. So a brief overview before we get into the research questions is that we were looking at, does readiness to learn predict skill outcomes in terms of literacy, numeracy, and poster, I like that. And then does RTL predict use of skills at home and at work? And then we looked particularly at mediating and moderating effects of RTL on the relationship between selected variables, we'll get into that, and skill level use. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we did.
Previous indications from just reviewing PIAAC and some of the research that has come before has certainly, and we've heard a number of times today, that the U.S. population is falling behind on these skill levels. That U.S. adults maybe has come out in some of the reports. U.S. adults have scored relatively higher on the use of skills. And so there is something of at least a discrepancy that has been pointed to between skill level and skill use that we thought was worth exploring some more. Or that was interesting, at least, and it will be part of our study. A bit of review of literature. The PIAAC data permits an examination of, as we've said, the literacy skill levels and skill use at home and in the workplace. Previous studies using the PIAAC have looked at skills in terms of human capital, quite a bit. Relationship to earnings, someone earlier today I think mentioned the Hanashuk et al. From 2013, and Allen, Levels, and Vandervelden had obtained data that pointed to this discrepancy between skill level and skill use. We did not see previous literature that looked particularly at non-cognitive factors and how those might relate to these skills and to the skill use. And the PIAAC background questionnaire did include factors that were a part of RTL. We became interested in RTL for our own reasons, and as we looked at the background questionnaire and at the conceptual papers that had preceded it. We found there were numerous ways of thinking about what RTL might be. These are some of the factors that were being considered in how we thought about it as a non-cognitive construct. At the end of the day, and after first developing a much longer lit review that our reviewers encouraged us to modify because it covered so much landscape it wasn't always clear, we resorted to simply sharing today our operational definition for readiness to learn, which is based on how it was actually measured in the background questionnaire. And I'll show you on the next slide. I don't know how well you'll see them, but essentially these are the items that were part of the Learning to Readiness scale, and it seems that they actually tap into some different dimensions of these non-cognitive variables. Oops, how did I get there? I skipped a one. I skipped something earlier, sorry. But for instance, the second item looks at curiosity for learning, we thought. The one that says, I like learning new things. Items 1 and 3 look at things like approaches to overcoming difficulty and cognitive scaffolding. And the last several items all look at problem solving in some way, or looking at connections between our existing knowledge and previous knowledge. But essentially, those were the indicators that we had to work with in terms of looking at readiness to learn. And Cecil is up next.
So this is my bit very briefly. Amy alluded to our research questions. We had two sets of 3 questions. The first set of questions pertaining to readiness to learn, predicting skill outcomes, and then looking at the extent to which readiness to learn mediates partially or fully the effects of these important demographic background factors, age, education, gender, and work experience on the skill levels, and also looking at the extent to which readiness to learn moderates the effects of these background factors. So what are the interactions between readiness to learn and the background factors in terms of skill levels? And then the second set of questions pertains to skill uses. So just plug in skill uses for skills there. They're the same, basically the same questions. I don't think I have to spend much time on our method. Our sample was the U.S. sample, so about 5,000 adults with population. You can see the more specific information in regards to the age distribution, gender distribution, and so on here on the slide. Average educational attainment and years of work experience, about 20 years on average in the population. So we conducted a series of regression analyses, multiple regression analyses. Again, the dependent variables skill level and skill use, and our predictor variables readiness to learn, and then the various demographic background variables. So Tom won the coin toss, so he gets to present our very interesting findings for you.
So our findings for the first research question, which was how does readiness to learn predict these 3 skill outcomes in addition to these other variables we included in there. We found that readiness to learn significantly and positively predicted each of the 3 skills, literacy, numeracy, and poster, I guess is our term here. And however, the relative strength for the prediction of readiness to learn was weak. And the other predictors, education, as we've consistently seen, was a positive, strong predictor of all 3 skills. And age was a relatively weak negative predictor of literacy and numeracy. However, it was a relatively strong negative predictor of poster. And then years of full-time work experience, that was a relatively weak predictor, and gender was a weak predictor of numeracy and poster. And here it was males scoring higher than females for numeracy and problem solving in technology-rich environments. And this is just a graphic that shows out of the total variation explained by the variables in the model, what proportion was explained by each. And as you can see here, education, which is the tan, was the predominant predictor. Readiness to learn was significant, but it wasn't a large predictor. You can see readiness to learn there in the blue. And this is for literacy. And age entered in there too to a greater extent than did readiness to learn. And again, age was a negative predictor of literacy. And numeracy, again, education, the predominant predictor, readiness to learn, significant but not strong. And then problem solving, age a little bit, education a little less predominant. Readiness to learn, again, was significant but not strong. Age comes in a little bit stronger here as a negative predictor. So older individuals had lower skills. And for research question 2, which is looking at the mediating effects, we found that readiness to learn partially mediated or partially explained the effects of education, age, work experience on each of the three skill outcomes. It did not mediate the effects of gender on skills. And just as a graphic, as an example of this mediation effects, if you look at the effect of gender on literacy skill, education on literacy skill, education controlling for the other variables in the model, everything except readiness to learn, accounted for about 29% of literacy skill differences. And when we entered in readiness to learn, that really explained about 1% of that 29% that education was explaining. So it partially mediated the effects of education. And similarly, when we looked at age, age accounting for the other variables in the model accounted for about 7.5% of the variability in problem-solving skills. When we entered in readiness to learn in the model, it explained about 0.5% of that 7.5%. And then the third research question was how does readiness to learn moderate or change the effects of gender, age, work experience, and education on those three outcomes? We found that readiness to learn did significantly moderate the effects of education on literacy and numeracy skills, and it also moderated the effects of age on both literacy and numeracy. And as an example of that, here we're looking at basically the effects of education on literacy skills, and obviously the low education workers had lower literacy skills, the higher education workers had higher literacy skills, but you can see it differed depending upon what level of readiness to learn they had. At the lower educational level, the readiness to learn made more of a difference in their literacy scores than it did at the high education level. And similarly, when we looked at age differences in numeracy, you can see at younger ages, this readiness to learn had more of an effect on the numeracy scores than it did at higher ages. And then research question 4, which paralleled research question 1, except that it looked at the use of skills. Here we found that readiness to learn positively predicted each of the three skills, both at home and at work. And the relative strength of prediction for readiness to learn was strong for skill use at home, but was weak for skill use at work. And so again, these pie charts here, you can see readiness to learn here in the purple, I think that is, on that screen, actually was the strongest predictor of reading skill use at home, and it trumped out even education here in terms of the use of this skill. But when we looked at reading skill use at work as opposed to at home, then readiness to learn becomes a much a weaker predictor than education, although it's still important. And then similarly, writing skill use at home, readiness to learn very predominant, the strongest predictor, but then writing skill use at work, the effect of readiness to learn lessens and education becomes more important. And then for numeracy skill use at home, readiness to learn, not quite as important as age here, but still fairly important. And then at work, the effect of readiness to learn lessens, and it becomes fairly equal amongst the different predictors. And then the ICT skill use at home, again, readiness to learn fairly strong, but then at work it weakens. And then research question 5, paralleling research question 2, the mediation effects, we found that readiness to learn consistently partially mediated the effect of education, work experience, and age on skill use, both at home and in the workplace, with effects similar to what occurred with skill levels. It did not mediate or explain gender differences in skill use. And then readiness to learn for the 6th research question, it did moderate or change the effect of education on ICT skill use at work, numeracy skills at home, and reading skills at home and at work.
So very quickly, we're going to go over the implications. So first of all, adult education practices that enhance readiness to learn among low education workers may be important. We need to leverage learning readiness in the workplace toward the application of a more diverse array of skills. And what we were thinking about here is that a lot of attention in workplace learning talks about transfer of learning from training programs to the actual work situation. And it may be important to start thinking about transfer of skill from home to work. But again, this isn't entirely clear. It's just an idea that we're playing around with. It's also important to look at individual interest, curiosity, and the ability to derive meaning from ideas and concepts. So transfer could be encouraged by establishing more meaningful connections between work experience and the individual's idea of what would be needed for new learning. Because this concept of readiness to learn seems to have a greater relationship to the kinds of learning that takes place at home, which may be derived from a more contextualized sense of need. Another implication could lie in the allocation of training resources. So workplace training that is appropriately contextualized for low literacy and low skill individuals may be particularly beneficial, but contextualized in terms of interest, not only just in terms of the workplace, the new skills. So, further research questions. The first one deals really with, well, what is readiness to learn? And so if you have another hour, we can talk about that. But, and then the relationship between readiness to learn and other constructs, such as employment status, civic engagement, skill development, and skill use in diverse settings. I'm sorry, I haven't been talking into this. Then, what is the relationship between readiness to learn and participation in adult education activities? And there's already been a lot of talk today about participation, and another piece would be to look at what is the connection, relationship between readiness to learn and participation in formal and non-formal. How does the relationship between readiness to learn and skill level use differ between countries? This was focused totally on the United States, and the next step would be really to look at some of the other countries using the PIAAC data. Because this is a European term, this is not our term. So we can do that. And then what are the psychometric properties of scores from the readiness to learn scale? And as we say, is readiness to learn a thing? We're not sure.
This is a new group for, not actually new, but a less familiar group to me. And there we go. And in addition, you should know this about me. I was on the problem solving and technology-rich environments group. We formed the framework, and the construct, we formed the items, and we did the scaling. It was an international group, a wonderful experience, and I think we're ready to go, huh? Okay. So here's some thoughts about these papers. These are the papers, and I just want to say a couple of things at the very beginning. First of all, they're outstanding papers, really important work, and I want to encourage, the second thing I want to encourage all of the authors before these go to publication, I'm assuming they're going to go to publication, that you have an opportunity here to really affect public policy with your data. So really tighten it down to the issues you want to communicate, you think are most powerful in your data, and then make public policy recommendations at the end, because the data is very compelling in a whole bunch of different dimensions. So I hope you do that. I am all about trying to get the world to change. And it's not easy, but one of the things you have to do is you have to distill it down to a very clear message. And I encourage you to do that. Well, the change to the workplace is pretty obvious to most of us. Here's an Australian cab going to the airport. I was speaking at the Australian Literacy Educators Conference in Sydney, and there were 17 different technologies for literacy that this cab driver was doing. I was just, I couldn't believe it. So I asked him to pull over, keep the thing running, and I interviewed him. I took field notes for half an hour about his literate practices with each one of these. It's profound. The changes we're going through are absolutely profound. This is also the BMW plant in Greenville, South Carolina. This area is surrounded by the actual car manufacturing. The cars are coming down the assembly line, and robots are riveting things together and putting pieces together, putting this car together. And a couple of people are walking around with the walkie-talkie back to these folks, telling them how things are going. In the meantime, they're problem solving in this technology-rich environment of the control room. It's absolutely amazing the way automobile manufacturing has changed. If you have not been in an automobile plant that is high-tech, you must go, because it really redefines the nature of workforce preparation. It is just so profound. Here are a few results that we have. These generally providing the context, not from these papers, but larger results. U.S. adults scored below the international in all three domains: numeracy, literacy, and problem solving. The percentage of U.S. adults who scored at the lowest levels was among the largest in PIAAC. The gaps in performance associated with SES are larger in the United States than any other participating country. Skill level is also correlated with attitudes and behaviors that support thriving democratic institutions. Interesting pattern. So that's the context. Now that's the broader context. And the thing, you probably already know this, but it is impressive to me and scary to me. These results are important to multinational corporations. They can go anywhere they want as long as there's a workforce that's prepared. And you've got to believe that they're looking at these results. You just have to believe that. We did not come up real well. Steve, a new friend, one of my former doctoral students, is out working with him. And I loved your work. Thank you so much for sharing it. I just want to put some of the high points here. Steve very creatively used the SAS to define a digital inclusion pathway leading from access to taste to readiness to digital literacy. This is going to be a very important construct for all of us because it gives us a developmental way to look at the issues rather than just looking at means for different populations. Digital literacy and ICT use is embedded in the earnings of prime age workers, and I know you are very cautious about causality, but it's tightly embedded in the earnings of prime age workers. That's why this novel assessment, the first time we've had an assessment like this, of problem-solving technology-rich environments, is so critically important because it is so closely associated with earnings. And also, digital literacy and ICT use in adults is also embedded measures of social trust, all of these positive attributes that make for a stronger democratic society. So it looks like it's a pretty powerful measure of important factors. On the second paper, in terms of transitions to literacy, This was a study of learners versus non-learners analysis. And a couple of high points that caught my attention: the ratio of post-secondary learners to non-learners, 3.4 to 1, is more than twice the high school level. I mean, that's pretty dramatic. And about 3 times that of the less than high school level. They also talked about a number of important barriers and motivators in their analysis. This is going to be very helpful to all of us in understanding better the blocks and the incentives for folks. And then they also looked at the predictors of adult participation in formal and informal learning. Very important work. And the other thing that caught my attention is this is they presented one of several data points that I heard today that really contribute to the income inequality issues that we face in our nation, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. It's hugely important to our nation. We do work in that area in the K-12 level. I'll mention it just briefly at the end, and it's another source of that issue. Then the third paper, Adults' Readiness to Learn as a Predictor of Literacy Skills, another outstanding paper. And I know you sort of bobbed and weaved around the issue of readiness, but it's not a bad construct. It's not a bad construct. We might think of a different label for it here in the U.S., but it's not a bad construct because, as Stephen pointed out, we want to look at these issues in a developmental progression. So it'll be very helpful to us. It's especially important, you noted, at the lower educational levels, and that's why it's really important, it seems to me. And it's more meaningful to the extent to which adults use information processing skills, which is also of importance in this area. And it looks like it's more related to skill use at home than at work. And Stephen, you found this as well. You, in your pathway, you said that it seemed to come in at home initially. And I may be wrong about that, but I think there might have been a gender pattern in there too. And then readiness to learn and other predictor variables only account for 25% of the variance in skill use. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So why are all of these data important? Well, we saw some images at the beginning. The nature of work has fundamentally changed. This is a General Motors model of economic management, top-down, command and control. And you waste the intellectual capital of all of these levels over here. The bottom 2/3 of the levels, people contribute very little intellectual capital to solving the problem. The orders come from up above. The line worker at the bottom just implements them, contributes little to the process, and we saw what happened to General Motors. And so companies and organizations have been changing. Now, my dream of all dreams is that 2 other units would change this way as well and flatten out the decision-making, empowering teams to make important decisions close to their area. One would be the educational system. We tend to be still command and control. And 2 would be the government. Darn it. We could be much better, much more efficient if somehow we figured out a way to empower teams and work a little more effectively. Anyway, the issue here is that you get greater intellectual capital use, and companies have figured this out. They're much more productive when they do this. They can outcompete a company that's very hierarchically structured. And in a very aggressive business world, the companies that restructure and take advantage of the intellectual capital are the ones that are more productive and tend to win at the end of the game. What do they do within these teams? Well, increasingly they're using online information resources to problem solve. And that's why problem solving in technology-rich environments, a horrible name. I hope they come up with something better than that. We refer to it as simply online reading or online research and comprehension, and problem solving is what it is. Because when we use the internet with information, we're reading. We're reading to solve a problem. It could be a small one, what's the best flight home? Or it could be a long one, or a large one. What is my role in this world in order to make more possible a world that is a better place? That's what we use the internet for. The information on the internet. Anyway, we use texting and other things for communication, but the information is that. And that's what these teams do. They often use online information to solve a problem They locate, they evaluate, they synthesize, and they solve the problem, and then they communicate the solution to everyone else throughout the organization. So the internet and other technologies are used extensively in the workplace today to conduct research, solve problems, and learn. Now, let me just give you a quick look what the K-12 response to a number of these issues that we're facing around the world. Common Core State Standards, like it, hate it, whatever it is, it's a pretty profound change. And there are three elements to these changes that that are driven by the same data that you're seeing here today. One, there's an increase on informational text reading in the K-12 schools. We are shifting away from narratives to informational text. Why? Because informational texts are what we use to solve problems with in online context. Two, higher level thinking is emphasized. Rather than literal understanding, we're looking at evaluative understanding, at higher forms of comprehension. And finally, new digital literacies are integrated for the first time into the Common Core State Standards. Not as well as I'd like, not in the right places, but it's the first time we've ever seen this in any set of standards here in the United States. I don't know if you know this or not, 3 billion people use the internet in the world. The growth rate is exponential. It increases at a faster rate every single year. The prediction is easily within 10 years, everyone or nearly everyone will have access to the internet. Some will have smartphones. Many will have smartphones, the vast majority. But increasingly, the internet is an important part of our lives. And what that means is if you're a second grader this year, by the time you graduate from high school, everyone will have access. The workplace will be even more profoundly changed. So an important theme in the studies that were presented today, first of all, seems to me that there's a substantial gap that may be growing between those at the top and the bottom in the U.S. economy. And that growing income inequality is a hugely important issue for all of us. There's related work to this you should know about. Sean Reardon out at Stanford did a really provocative series of studies with national assessment data in reading, math, and science over since 1940. And he found that the 90-10 income achievement gap for school-aged children using national test scores in reading is growing faster than the black-white achievement gap. It's related to the work that's been presented here today, and it should be cause for concern for all of us. There's also a separate and independent achievement gap that we found in a recent study appeared in RRQ, Reading Research Quarterly. It'll formally appear in January. The pre-release has already gone out, and the New York Times and other publications have picked up on it. But it was it found a separate and independent achievement gap based on income inequality for online reading. That is, when we controlled for pretest differences in offline reading, offline reading, offline writing, and prior knowledge. We controlled for those variables between a very wealthy and a somewhat poor, not very poor, a somewhat poor school district, students at one grade level, all of the students at the 7th grade level. We controlled for those, and there was a separate and independent achievement gap for students' ability to read online. So our notion of the achievement gap in reading is actually much greater than what we think it is, because we only measure it with offline reading performance. And as we move from page to screen, reading is going to increasingly take place online. And so it was not just a minimal, it was an effect size, a Hedges G size, which is a measure of how big an effect is, from 0.94 to 1.4, which is large. It's categorized as a large effect size. And it was across the board with both assessments that we used, with every skill item that we measured, and with every category of skills that we measured. Also, the Congressional Budget Office in 2007 came out with a very thorough report showing how income inequality is increasing in the United States. All of these are related to the data that we're seeing here. It seems to me that income inequality is hugely important in the work that we talk with one another about here today and tomorrow. And finally, there's this last data point, recent study that economic mobility, going up the income ladder, is now less in the United States than it is in Europe and other developed nations. Thank you. Now, I want to talk about some methodological issues with PIAAC and problem solving. There are some methodological issues in all of this. This may not be our focus here today, but you need to be cautious about these results. First of all, the background variables. I looked through PIAAC, and I couldn't find where they went out and at least did a validation study checking for the self-report data validity. That is, you can go out and if somebody reports that they're a high school graduate, you can go out and check that and test it. And I may be wrong, but I'm not sure on all of this self-report data. I don't know if they validated that or not. And self-report data is somewhat problematic, as I'll mention. They also have separated scenario-based tasks. I'll talk about that rather than full performance-based tasks, and I'll talk about the limitations of that. And then the evaluation of search engine use was not included. It was not included. They did not have adults try and locate information on the internet. So here's the self-report data issue. It's widely used, of course, in surveys, research. But some people, measurement people especially, consider it somewhat unreliable due to social desirability response bias. That is, participants sometimes say what they think you want to hear or what is socially more valued. So we have to be careful about that. And as I said, typically external validations measures are used. And it may have been done, but I just couldn't find it. I looked and looked and I couldn't find it. Here's the scenario-based tasks in problem solving. The scenario-based tasks are better than just flat multiple choice, but they're still multiple choice. Don't get them wrong, they're still multiple choice. And so here's an issue where they have to figure out which of these tabs up at the top provides them with the best information. Which of those websites provides them with the best information, but they still have to pick over on the left A, B, C, or D. They're given a scenario on the left and then an image of a web page or other technology tool, and then you have to manipulate it some way. But the manipulation is very limited and it's quite restricted. So there are 3 different ways of measuring digital literacies, from least restricted to most restricted, a simulation, a full simulation of what it's like, a scenario-based, which problem solving used, and then flat multiple choice. We looked at this in a large federal research grant, the ORCA project, where we developed simulation assessments for 7th graders of online research and comprehension. And we found actually the simulations were more reliable by about 10%. Thank you. We also found that we had a better picture of component difficulty. That is, the 4 categories of skills we evaluated. The blue line is multiple choice. It's pretty flat. You get 25% right by just guessing, and so that presents a flatter pattern of scores. You get less discrimination, and as a result, you get less valuable information on how students actually perform. The red line is the simulation, and you get a much clearer picture of how students perform, what the weak areas, what the strong areas are. So our initial thoughts on comparing more restricted and least restricted simulations context is simulations demonstrated richer dimensionality, they demonstrated higher levels of reliability, and they demonstrated greater variability of component scores. So really what I'm arguing here is that eventually we need to move to simulations in problem solving with online, and we also need to include locating information. Locating information is a bottleneck skill. If you can't locate information, you can't solve your problem. You can't read. You can't get access to the information you need. So simulations such as of complex online learning tasks are possible, and they're likely to generate richer and more useful psychometric data. And the current constructs of literacy and problem solving technology-rich environments are inevitably going to be merged. I have no doubt about that. Literacy will be the literacy of online reading, perhaps in 10 years from now. But in the meantime, we have 2 parallel tracks going with offline reading and online reading. And eventually, My best guess is that we'll have a literacy construct, and it'll include a wide variety of reading contexts. Quick implications. Clearly, workforce preparation needs to be an important priority, and it needs to include digital literacies for problem solving. Equally as clear, we need to attack the growing income achievement gap in the United States, and workforce preparation is one part of the issue. The digital inclusion pathway is important initial guidance, and it appears important to focus on adult education practices that enhance the readiness to learn of low education learners. And workplace learning is limited by many non-learners and learners at low education levels. So thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask first, before we take questions, is there anyone who can answer the question about whether the educational attainment, there was any validation work done? And anyone on the phone or from NCES who's here? Yeah? Steve?
You want me to comment on that?
Stephen Pravasnik?
Hi, yes. I'm Stephen Pravasnik from the National Center for Education Statistics, and have worked with Jaleh since the very beginning of PIAAC, and Eugene Owen, who sadly isn't here today. So I'm going to speak up to provide a response to Dr. Liu in regard to the question that you kind of posed, having to do with the search, because you're right. Currently, in the PSTRE, there's actually no search mechanism for an online search. And that began with such items. However, the reason they had to be dropped had specifically to do with comparability across all the different languages that were used, and specifically because of the Japanese restrictions on the way that search engines work in Japanese. There are so many homonyms when you have the kanji characters, and it presented insurmountable difficulties, and we had to drop, sadly, those because we had worked so hard to develop those items. And so in return, all that is in it, all that we ended up being able to put in are preset results for a search as if it was done for you, and then to evaluate what was found. But you're absolutely right, and we were very aware of that and very sad when we had to actually drop those items.
There was another question also about validating the responses on their level of education.
So I'm happy to talk about the educational attainment item in particular, which is an item that has been used for a long, long time on federal surveys. And all I can say is you don't really want to look at how the sausage is made very deeply. There are a lot of issues with that educational attainment item, and even people at the Census Bureau who work in that field in the demographic area will say that we understand that people who, have like an associate's degree or an educational certificate sometimes put themselves in high school, sometimes in some college, sometimes even at the associate's degree level if they have a certificate. So they haven't been validated in terms of this study for sure, in terms of knowing whether somebody who answered high school on the survey actually has a high school credential. But this is the standard item. It's the best we've got right now. It does need to be evaluated and reevaluated and improved. And hopefully that's something that the federal statistical system will address in the future.
Thank you. All right. Any questions about any of the papers or the discussants' comments?
Hi, I'm David Rosen, and I actually have a question for Steve, my colleague. Steve, you made an important distinction between ICT skills and digital literacy skills. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, and particularly since the findings were so different for different categories of people in some ICT skills versus digital literacy skills.
Is this hot? It is. Thanks for that question, David. Well, when I was talking about digital literacy, I was talking about the sort of final, in many ways, biggest stage of the developmental model, and I was saying that where someone was in the digital literacy space could be measured in a number of different ways. problem solving being one of the ways I looked at in PIAAC, ICT use, both at home and in the workplace, being other ways to look at it. So I wasn't really comparing digital literacy with ICT use. I was using digital literacy as a sort of an umbrella or a container for a number of measures that are interrelated but distinct.
Hi, I'm Mike Tentel from the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, and I have a question about the third paper, addressed to the third paper. If any of the author would like to comment on the Readiness to Learn Index that you used. I was wondering how you define, I noticed the low readiness to learn and high readiness to learn, and how you decided on the distinction, and whether you looked at the index as a continuous variable or not. Thank you.
Yeah, for the Readiness to Learn Index, when we did the analysis, we used it as a continuous variable. The plots that I showed up there, it was artificially discretized just for the purposes of display purposes, and that was just looking at the mean score for doing a median split of the two. So the mean score for the low half and the mean score for the high half. But the variable itself in the analysis we used as a continuous variable. And we've also done, we haven't shown it here or done it in this paper, but we've worked independently on doing some psychometric analyses of the Readiness to Learn instrument, the scores from the instrument. And it actually does show pretty good properties. We did some reliability analyses and some invariance analyses across gender and educational level and age. And it actually performs pretty well, surprisingly. Because initially when we were doing this, we weren't really clear of where it came from. But so when we started talking about it, just operationally defining it in terms of how it's measured, I think it works a little better. And I guess we have a little more confidence in the measure now that we're doing these analyses.
Thank you for the presentations. I'm also addressing the Readiness to Learn group. My question is, first of all, whether there's any correlation, or whether you found or checked for a correlation between readiness to learn and participation in non-formal education, because when we did, we found a very small correlation that surprised me. And I wonder, the same, by the way, for readiness to learn and learning at work. And I wondered whether somebody knows if there have been discussions before to separate the scales, to make sure that they have different constructs, different theoretical frameworks behind readiness to learn and learning at work, in order to make sure that they do not interfere too much. Because otherwise I would have supposed that learning at work and readiness to learn should correlate a bit more than when with very small effect sizes and sometimes negatively. And there is another pattern on readiness to learn, because this is a self-reported question. And when we searched for international comparison on readiness to learn, we found patterns. The Asian and the post-Soviet and the Southern European and the West and the rest behave differently, and the Scandinavian. And I would not interpret that as, let's say, the Germans being less ready to learn than the US people, but maybe as kind of a social desirability issue.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the first question, I think, was looking at whether readiness to learn predicts participation in adult education training. And we actually have done some analysis as a separate paper, just preliminary analysis looking at that. And I think we're planning on presenting at the American Educational Research Association for that. And I think our preliminary findings, I've just pulled up the paper here because I can't remember, but I believe, readiness to learn significantly predicted formal participation in formal adult education practices, but not informal. Non-formal, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. And I think you had another question about readiness to learn in terms of predicting learning at work. You have to look back again here and see. I think readiness to learn did predict Yeah, all three skills, both at home and at work, and in terms of the use of the skills at home and at work, it did significantly predict all of them. But it was again much stronger for at home. And I'm sorry, the other questions?
It was just a comment.
Oh, okay.
It was just a comment on readiness to learn being a self-reported skill, which could lead to
Oh.
cultural patterns when you compare Asian countries with Western countries.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we'll just say a couple of words about that. We really struggled with what readiness to learn was. We went into this thinking that we were looking at learning strategies because that was really what it was called in certain parts of the document. But then in other parts, it became clear that their items were not really just related to learning strategies. And when we wrote to the people who wrote the background questionnaire and when we wrote to OECD, both of them in different ways said, well, we never really developed what readiness to learn was. So we really feel that we're starting here and we're kind of organically developing what this idea is, and that's why we fell back on defining it operationally for the moment. And is it culturally based? That's really interesting. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all. We'll have to talk to you later about what you're finding.
I was just going to say we're
Go ahead.
surprised and delighted to find that there may be others who are interested in this construct, and we would be happy to talk to you afterwards.
We're thrilled.
Hi. Thank you again for the papers. I especially appreciated Margaret's report where it reminded me of the various national workplace literacy projects of a different era. Ron, how much was it that was invested in workplace literacy? Do you recall? It was a multi-year effort, and some of the lessons from that body of programs also gets picked up here.
Thank you.
But I also, it's with that?
300 plus projects and 200
Oh, there's, yeah, so thank you, Jim. So Jim was in the middle of all that too. Right, my question, I'm sort of picking up on Don's references to the changed work environment, both in terms of a global economy, the changes in work systems and manufacturing. It seems to me the real challenge here, as many have mentioned, is so how do we find more resources to invest in low-income or low-wage workers? So one of the questions I think wasn't answered in the workplace literacy projects was how do we increase employer investment? Because many of the employers that participated in that didn't do it because of the federal grant. They did it because it matched changes in the overall work systems. And so the federal money actually was if I recall this right, was not really an incentive. It was reinforcing what they had already decided to do. And it seems to me, Don, I love your approach, your suggestion that we all should go see an auto plant to see how manufacturing has changed. But I think one of the things that's also going along with our dilemma around income inequality is that even in manufacturing, it's not just the work systems that have changed, but we now have temp agencies that are staffing these manufacturing companies, which then changes the way of who the employer is and who's going to invest in low-income, low-wage workers. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges if we all agree that we need more resources for a population that is increasingly contingent in many workplaces, and it's now being the responsibility, both in terms of time and money, is being placed on the individual.
Can I just respond to what he just said?
Oh, yeah?
Okay. Not to respond, I agree with you totally. And one of the things we allude to in our paper, although we didn't really talk about it here, is the fact that a lot of the training that companies now pay for in business and industry are for the higher level workers. And so, and one, I think, a really interesting trend is that a lot of these companies are moving more towards self-directed learning for training. And so they're not putting a whole lot of money even at the higher end, but only the higher end can take advantage of the self-directed learning possibilities. So I think it's getting even more dire than you were saying. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
Hi. This question may be too broad, but a lot of things that are coming up are really turning into living skills, if you will. Tony and I and some others here work with a lot of specialized populations such as seniors, older Americans, limited English proficiency, that kind of thing. So with more and more emphasis on broadband adoption, getting online, having health records, having access to care and services through mHealth, being able, aging in place is a big thing right now that people are looking at carefully. So if you're not working, or you're either because of your age or you have a disability, all these different things, how are you going to keep up with this stuff? How are you going to do your online banking? How are you going to Skype your grandkids? How are you going to access care and benefits? And so much pressure about go online, go online, go online. And then you buy a system and you learn it and it's obsolete in a year. And, you know, so maybe that's a little too broad, but this is the question I was trying to answer at the morning break, and I guess I'm still wondering about a lot of it. So if anyone has thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
Can I take us?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great comment. One of the details I didn't have time to go into was that for the healthcare outcome, though this is a self-reported with all the issues of that, it is a general question that's been used in many federal surveys in this country. The strongest impact of digital literacy, and this is ICT use, not problem-solving proficiency, is in health status, excuse me. And the interesting thing is the effect is much stronger than the comparable effects looking at literacy or numeracy use in the same model. So this is really about ICT use being linked to healthcare, and it is true in seniors particularly. So that I think that, you know, with all of the economic limitations and constraints that Tony mentioned, I think we have outside of work opportunities for getting investments in the development of digital literacy to support better healthcare outcomes.
Steve, was digital literacy linked to health status?
Health status, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, one thing this has shown is there's lots more work to do with the PIAAC data, and with that, we'll turn it over to the table conversations.